My name is Thomas Locke. This is my story of how I survived the night of the hunt. I live in a land far to the west by a vast sea, where I've studied long hours to become a proper doctor, far from the influence of the healing church. The evening in question began as any other. We had heard the stories, how Yharnam had descended into madness, the city overrun by the beast plague, and the church powerless to stop it. My brother Anton was still there. Fear drove me to find him that night, to save him, if I could. While it was still light, I packed my medical bag. My wife insisted I take a pistol, along with several quicksilver bullets, for any beasts that might lurk. I'm glad she told me to. I may not have returned to write this. Though considering the madness I saw that night, I'm not even sure I truly have. I was invited to stay at my friend Myra Iosefka's clinic to help care for anyone seeking refuge on the night of the hunt. I kissed my wife goodbye and boarded a carriage bound for Yharnam. As the carriage departed, I glanced back through the window. In the mirror, I saw her chasing after us, her voice lost under the clatter of hooves on cobblestone. Something cold settled in my chest. I was alone in the carriage as the countryside rolled by, the sun sinking low behind the hills. The tall, spired towers of Yharnam loomed larger with each passing moment. Even from afar, the stories of Yharnam sent chills through me. The oldest parts of the city, long overrun by the plague. But it was the silence that unnerved me the most. For a city of that size, even on the night of the hunt, there should have been more life. Other carriages leaving, supplies coming in, but there was nothing. I leaned out the window, catching the cabbie's gaze from under his shrouded hood. His face was hidden, his posture stiff. Hesitant, I asked, "Excuse me, sir. Will you be here tomorrow at the same time?" The cabbie said nothing at first, the wind stirring his cloak, but not a word from his lips. I was about to ask again when he finally muttered, "Yes, if you make it to tomorrow in this town." The words settled over me like a shroud. The fear returned, stronger this time. It whispered, urging me to turn back. But it was too late. Anton. I had to find him. The spires of Yharnam grew taller, looming over us like the bones of some ancient creature. The gates creaked open as we approached. Without a word spoken, we passed rows of homes, many with coffins stacked outside, as if waiting for their occupants. The people there were quick. Lanterns flickered to life, blue flames burning from silver nitrate, as if to ward off something unseen. Doors slammed shut after a mere moment's hesitation. Their eyes, those who dared to look out, were filled with pity. Fear turned to dread. One woman caught my gaze as I passed. She raised her hand in the gesture of the healing church. I mirrored it instinctively, but the act brought me no comfort. At last, the carriage slowed, stopping in front of a fountain in a courtyard. No water flowed from its spout. The basin was dry, long since abandoned like the city itself. I stepped out, clutching my bag tight, trying to calm the trembling in my hands. Yharnam awaited. No sooner had I stepped outside the carriage than the cabbie shouted a sharp, "Yah! Yah!" He cracked the reins, and the horses whinnied as the carriage sped away from Yharnam. I assumed I would return to this spot the next morning, if I could make it. As I began walking through the empty streets, my footsteps echoed against the silence. Some windows, barred and dimly lit, flickered with movement, I caught glimpses of people loading rifles, preparing for a defense that felt futile. My grip on my bag tightened, yet the cold autumn air kept the sweat from forming, allowing me to maintain my hold. While there was still light, I adjusted my glasses and reached into my bag for the letter with Myra's instructions. She had told me to walk until I found a street sloping up at a steep 45-degree angle. At the flat portion, I would see a gate leading to more inclined streets. I needed to turn right at that gate, and I would find a small graveyard before the clinic. Yharnam's grimness was palpable as I stuffed the letter back into my bag. The unsettling silence enveloped me, the light waning with every moment. Suddenly, a loud caw startled me from behind. I turned to see a crow, perched just a few feet away. But these weren't ordinary crows. These were the size of cats. Wings and bellies low to the ground, their heads tilting as they studied me. Before I could react, several more surged forward, cawing and flapping their wings rapidly. Panic gripped me. I gasped and bolted down the street, clutching my bag and hat tightly as their raucous cries faded behind me. Glancing back, I saw that they had stopped, still watching me from a distance, their dark forms silhouetted against the deepening twilight. Eventually I reached the street Myra had mentioned, a perfect 45-degree incline rising steeply toward the horizon. Railings lined either side, and I began to ascend. I couldn't help but wonder about the city's design. The spiraling structures, cathedrals reaching for the sky, were awe-inspiring yet absurd. It was no wonder the plague spread here. Such close quarters would surely be a breeding ground for rats and vermin. Perhaps those enormous crows feasted on them, developing an immunity to the plague that transformed them into those monstrous shadows. My legs began to ache as I reached the flat portion of the street. The sky was painted in deep oranges and purples, the sun dipping lower. A cold feeling settled in my gut. I had to get to Myra's clinic before darkness fell, that much was certain. I began walking along the flat portion of the street, following the instructions Myra had given. The silver nitrate lanterns flickered in the front of the homes, casting eerie shadows on more rows of coffins. My mind reeled. Were these coffins already filled, or merely waiting for bodies? What I wasn't prepared for was what would happen next. It showed me just how far Yharnam had truly fallen. As I passed an alleyway between two tall, crumbling townhouses, a low growl stopped me in my tracks. Before I could react, a hand wielding a woodcutter's axe lurched from the shadows. I barely had time to stumble back, my foot catching on the curb as I fell hard onto the street. My breath caught in my throat as crazed eyes glinted from the dark. He stepped forward and my heart sank. An impossibly tall man, his limbs gangly and distorted, emerged from the shadows. He wore traditional Yharnam garb, a petticoat and breeches, though both were stretched beyond their limits, torn and frayed, barely clinging to his frame. His body was wild, with hair scraggly and unruly like the overused steel wool my wife once used to clean the horseshoes. His beard and hair stuck out in random directions from beneath a weathered top hat. And his eyes, those crazed, bloodshot eyes, were deep crimson, the yellow of his sclera almost glowing in the dim light. His lips were twisted, pulling back into a grotesque grin, revealing 2 rows of jagged yellow fangs. "Plague-ridden rat!" he muttered, staggering forward, gripping the axe in both hands. "I'll get rid of you!" I scrambled backwards, my heart pounding, unable to find my footing. I fumbled with my bag, my hand shaking as I pulled out my flintlock pistol, cocking the hammer back. I aimed at him, my voice barely steady as I shouted, "Stay back!" But he didn't stop. He raised the axe higher, his voice growing more deranged. "You plague-ridden rat!" Before he could bring the axe down, a sharp metallic sound cut through the air. The man staggered, a halberd's blade now protruding from his chest. Blood poured from his mouth as he grunted in confusion. Collapsing to his knees, behind him a tall figure in a trench coat, face obscured by a mask, stood holding the halberd. Around his neck, a sash bore the symbol of the healing church. With one swift motion, my savior yanked the halberd free and brought it down into the man's midsection, finishing him. Without hesitation, he reached out, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. "Can you run?" he asked, his voice urgent but steady. I opened my mouth, my lips trembling, but nothing came out. The sheer terror paralyzed me. "Can you run?" he snapped. Yes, I stammered. "Then I would do it," he said, glancing down at the sloped street. I followed his gaze and saw them. More of those gangly figures. A mob wielding axes, pitchforks, and torches. Their voices merged into a single haunting chant. "Plague, get it out." My legs locked in fear. What have I gotten myself into? The man shoved me hard, forcing me into motion. "Run!" he shouted, pulling out a pistol and firing into the crowd. I wanted to stay, to help him, but the sight of that horde overwhelmed me. I bolted, my feet pounding against the stone streets, not daring to look back. My chest burned as I ran, my heart racing with the rhythm of my footsteps. Finally, I reached Myra's clinic, the iron gates looming before me. I pushed them open, rushed inside and slammed the doors behind me, locking them and jamming a chair under the handle for good measure. Panting heavily, I stumbled back, only now realizing I had been enveloped in darkness. I took a moment to catch my breath, huffing as sweat began to form on my hands from the experience. Distant sounds of gunfire echoed outside, but they weren't getting closer. I knew I had to find Myra. A single dim lantern hung from the ceiling of the clinic's waiting room, casting a feeble glow over the scene. The darkness loomed ahead in the hallway, punctuated by grunts and growls of struggle. It seemed my ideals were far from over, especially as the last light from the setting sun disappeared through the barred windows. My best hope was that Myra was alive and could help me make sense of the events of this evening. I spotted an unlit lantern on the ground and picked it up, rocking it back and forth to gauge how much kerosene remained. Leaning in closer, I listened over the grunts and echoing in the darkness. Thick sloshing. Good, it was largely full. I took out a match, lighting the wick. The lantern handle creaked as I held it aloft, the light penetrating the suffocating darkness, revealing bloodied sheets draped over several gurneys leading into a library. It appeared Myra had seen quite a few patients lately. I knew standing still wouldn't do me any good. Remaining here was just one step further away from Anton. I called out, "Hello?" but only received a painted snarl in response. I stepped in further, my footsteps echoing against the wooden floors as my eyes adjusted to the heavy gloom. Suddenly, I came upon the source of the grunting and snarling. One of those gnarled men, his hair thickening into black as night, nails transformed into claws, his face shifting into that of a wolf. He struggled against the restraints that creaked ominously. I quickly drew my gun, keeping it trained on him, as I sidled along the edges of the gurneys. The creature's gurney rattled violently, slamming against nearby bookshelves, causing some volumes to topple onto his head, yet he showed no signs of stopping. As I watched in horror, one of his restraints snapped with a loud crack. My heart sank. I kept my pistol aimed at the creature, its attention finally turning to me. Just then, I heard a door open. "Thomas? What are you doing here? Get in here now!" Myra's voice rang out, pulling me from my fearful trance. Without a second thought, I stowed my pistol and sprinted towards her. The creature snarling in pursuit, a narrow staircase led into the main office of Myra's clinic. My feet pounding against the stairs as I felt the beast's claws scrape my ankle, trying to pull me back. "Thomas!" Myra called, her urgency driving me to look back. The The creature was wedged at the bottom of the stairs, its dark frame distorted, almost as if the shadows themselves were dragging me back into the abyss. Just then, I saw Myra emerge from her office, a bottle in hand. "Come on, come on!" she shouted, and with a swift motion she hurled the bottle at the creature's face. It shattered on impact, releasing a hissing acid that made the creature howl in pain and release my foot. I seized the opportunity, finishing my sprint up the stairs as Myra helped me inside. She slammed the door and bolted it just as the creature slammed against it, the sound of metal straining filling the air. Despite its immense strength, the beast couldn't break through. I could hear its frustrated snarls, a guttural sound of disappointment as it realized its prey had escaped. After a moment, the room fell silent, and Myra and I breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank goodness you're all right," she exclaimed, embracing me tightly. Myra Iosefka, a longtime friend who I had known for years before she left for Yharnam to pursue research under the Healing Church. We parted ways over differing ideals about healing. I chose to learn medicine away from the church, wanting to be a proper doctor without relying on their methods. Myra, however, followed the church's path religiously, fully believing that blood ministration was the best way to heal others. Don't get me wrong, I've seen what Yharnam's blood can do. We even receive shipments of the healing blood in my practice. But those who take it, they're never the same. I never recommended blood ministration unless it was a dire emergency. Few understood my aversion to the practice, my least of all. But perhaps it was the distance both in time and philosophy that allowed her to still care for my well-being tonight. As I sat eating a bowl of stew, the first proper meal I'd had since a sandwich on the carriage ride to Yharnam, Myra examined my ankle. Her clinic was small, yet it offered an air of comfort, though the atmosphere was tinged with the unmistakable copper scent of blood. I took a bite of the stew, relishing its warmth, and joked, "Given the state of the city, I was beginning to think you were lost to it too." Myra smiled, placing the bandage gently on my ankle. "Well, good thing the beast didn't scratch your ankle, or you would have been lost too." She sat across from me, sipping her tea. I set my bowl aside and smiled. "It's been too long, Myra." "It has, Thomas," she said, returning the smile. Then she added, teasing, "So, still attempting medicine the traditional way?" I chuckled. My resistance to blood ministration had always been something that mildly irritated her. "Yes," I replied. "I still find it works quite well, actually." Myra shook her head lightly, amusement in her voice. "I don't understand you, Thomas. You have the mind of someone who wants to help, but you've seen what these blood vials can do." She stood up, plucked one from the shelf, holding it up as if it were a prize. "Reconnecting limbs, regrowing tissue, blood ministration is a miracle of science." She placed the vial back with a sigh and looked at me. "And yet, you stick to your theory of long-term damage. Why?" I could still smell the iron in the air, the essence of blood that had seeped into every crevice of her clinic. "Because I've seen it," I said quietly. "The people who use these vials long-term, they go mad. Not with typical old age either. It's something deeper, something worse. I know I can't stop people, but I can at least encourage them not to rely on it." Myra chuckled, staring at the ground. Same old Thomas. The silence stretched on, and I noticed how long she had been staring at the floor. Her mood shifting uncomfortably, I cleared my throat, snapping her from her reverie. "Myra?" She lifted her head slowly. "Sorry about that." It felt odd, but I didn't press her. Refocusing on the reason I came to Yharnam, I set my empty bowl aside and leaned forward. "Listen, Myra, I'm looking for my brother, Anton. The entire reason I came here is to find him, and maybe help anyone else I can. Do you know which district he lives in?" Myra leaned back, her expression softening. "I believe he lives near Old Town." She paused, noticing the tension in my jaw at the mention of the area. "But not in it. To my knowledge, you're not thinking of going out there, are you? If you thought this part of town was bad, Cathedral Ward and areas near Old Town are much worse." My heart sank at her words. The thought of Anton being anywhere near that district filled me with dread. But then, memories of our childhood flooded back, of us playing in the dunes by the sea, of why I had come all this way to find him. I straightened up and said, Things are much worse than I imagined, I'll admit, but I'm not leaving the city without him. There are no patients here, so can you take me to him? Myra smiled softly, but something changed in her eyes, a fleeting darkness I couldn't quite place. Of course, but you'll need supplies. Go upstairs, there's a chest by my mixing station, you'll find what you need. I stood, grateful for her help, and offered a warm smile. Thank you, Myra, for being a friend despite our differences. She nodded and I turned toward the staircase. The rest of her clinic was dark, the only light coming from my lantern. The sun had set, though the moon had not yet risen. The lamplight cast eerie shadows as I ascended, the unsettling atmosphere of her clinic beginning to weigh on me. Something felt off. As I walked through her clinic, I saw papers scattered about on the floor, some edges caught and clinging to the floorboards. I raised a brow at this and called out, "Myra, are these papers on the floor important?" She called back, "Don't worry about those, I'll take care of everything." Once again, Myra's tone and cadence threw me off a touch. The papers in her tone reminded me of Anton. The day he left for Yharnam was a somber day. Anton's wife had been suffering from tuberculosis, and he had begged me to cut her open and forcibly cleanse the infection from her lungs, using blood ministration to save her life afterwards. I told him she would not be guaranteed to survive such a procedure, yet he begged me for even the slimmest chance. I understood where he was coming from, but I would not be responsible for such a death. Even with blood ministration, her quality of life after such a procedure, with little guarantee of success, wouldn't be anything to speak of. Anton felt I was abandoning the both of them. That was 10 years ago. Anton and I rarely spoke through letters, but when his letters became less frequent, his most recent one stated that he was finally going to be with Anna again, I was concerned. It was that letter and its cryptic nature that led me here, in the vain hope that I could talk some sense into him and bring him home at last. I walked up the stairs in the eerie quiet of Myra's clinic, long windows casting shadows from semi-distant lamplight as I spotted the door to her mixing room. I opened it and looked around, turning the dial for the gas lamp to illuminate the space. I spotted the chest in question and moved aside a gurney that was in the way, opening the chest to find a map of Yharnam and a blood vial unlike any I had seen before. This one had a very light red coloring. Just by holding it, I felt a sense of purity, not the sense of minor dread I received from holding the others. If Myra said what I needed was in here, I had a feeling this file was part of it. Stowing the file, I found a cane with a head that detached to reveal a rapier. I hadn't fenced for quite some time, even in practice, but I suppose some kind of close-range weapon would be better than nothing at all, given the circumstances. As I removed more items, I saw a faint glow at the bottom of the chest. Pushing a paper aside, I noticed some slug-like creature, undulating and squirming, a mix of a worm and something else, about the size of half my arm, glowing like moonlight or starlight. I raised a brow at this, gazing at the creature curiously. I felt a power from it, something that could be used. I was compelled to reach for it as well. But suddenly there was a jumbling from the closet by the door. I quickly grabbed the pistol from my bag and turned around, pointing it at the door as the closet rumbled further from something inside, accompanied by incoherent mumbling. Who's there?" I shouted as I cocked back the first hammer on my pistol. The rumbling got louder as the door shook violently. "Come out!" I demanded. Then there was a calm before the door swung open softly. Staggering out was a creature I couldn't quite identify. It stood like a man, but its appearance was inhuman. Its skin was a pale blue, glowing softly, like a clear summer night. Its head was massive, easily the size of its equally round body. Its fingers were round and stubby at the ends, and its mouth, there was no mouth. It was a tube of some kind, short, wobbling, and writhing like the creature in the chest. I asked, What are you?" I was tempted to ask who, but I wasn't sure I would have gotten a response. Without second thought, its glimmering eyes set on me before it charged, swinging its digits about and making some kind of gurgling noise. I screamed, "Stay back! I'm warning you!" The moment my back pressed against the wall, I fired. A hole through its midsection. Blue plasma of some kind splattered against the wall as it fell to its knees, then to the ground. Its head was so massive that it obscured my view of Myra, who was now standing in the doorway with a crazed look on her face. She gripped a cane similar to the one I found and said, "So, now you know." Her pupils were now a deep crimson as she began walking in, slowly, menacingly. My flintlock pistol had a second hammer and barrel that I cocked, pointing it at her as I said, "Myra, what are you doing? Stay back." She paused just for a moment, shaking her head and laughing. "Thomas, you always were foolish. Foolish for refusing what so many others have taken," she said as she drew a weapon from her cane. A whip, but not just any whip. Its segments were serrated, small blades gleaming along each link. I might have admired the craftsmanship, but I was certain how she intended to use it. "Myra, come to your senses! It's me! It's Thomas!" I shouted louder, desperation creeping into my voice. Her look grew even more crazed. "Yes, and you must be made to accept what is inevitable and infinite." Her voice took on a dreamlike quality as she raised her other arm. Myra was wearing the robes of the Healing Church, but from the long sleeves emerged something horrific. Tentacles, black as the night sky itself, slithering out and writhing towards me. They were the same color as the creature that now lay dead on the floor. My body moved before I could think, ducking just as the tentacles lashed out, missing me but knocking over several bookshelves in the process. The scattered shelves gave me a makeshift cover, and I scrambled beneath them, hunched over as I quickly reloaded my gun. Myra's footsteps grew closer as she taunted, "You think you can hide, Thomas?" I could hear the eerie scraping of her whip dragging along the floor. She pulled one of the bookshelves away with the strength of those unnatural appendages. I could see the tentacles coiling around the shelf, yanking it back and smashing it against the wall with a shattering crash. "The old ways are done. You call it madness. But what it is truth," she declared. Her voice dripped with some sick certainty as she continued dismantling my cover, one bookshelf at a time. My hands trembled, but I managed to reload and cock the hammers. Was I really going to shoot my friend? But whatever she planned for me, it wasn't good. She left me with no choice. I gripped the pistol with both hands, my heart racing. As the last shelf was thrown aside, I didn't hesitate. Instinct kicked in. I aimed for her knee, firing off a resounding shot. The bullet hit its mark. Myra collapsed to the floor, gasping in pain. She clutched at her knee, her face etched with a pale, moonlit agony. The redness faded from her eyes, and for a moment I saw something moving beneath her skin. An insect-like bulge crawling across her forehead, slowly making its way down her face. I froze, staring in horror and confusion. "Myra?" I asked hesitantly. She blinked, her expression softening, and for the first time in years, it felt like she truly saw me. "Thomas? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling with recognition and confusion. We looked at each other for what felt like an eternity, both of us piecing together the shattered remnants of what was happening. But the moment was fleeting. Myra's eyes widened with sudden urgency. "Thomas, you have to get out of here, now," she said, her voice strained as she tried to rise. "But Myra, your knee!" I stammered, but she waved me off, struggling to her feet. "There's no time. I can't explain everything, but you need to take everything from that chest and run. Find your brother and leave this city." She grabbed my arm, shoving me towards the scattered supplies. I frantically gathered them up, stuffing everything into my bag, and I tried to ask, "But what happened? Myra, what's going on?" She growled, her face contorting with pain again. The same bubbling appeared under her skin, only more rapid and undulant, her muscles twitching as though something inside her was fighting for control. "Thomas, something has taken control over me. Something I can't control. Have you got everything?" she rasped. I nodded, clutching my bag. "Good," she grunted, grabbing my hand as she hobbled towards the back door, her limp growing less pronounced with every step. To my horror, I watched her injured knee begin regenerating before my eyes, flesh and sinew knitting itself back together as though the shot had never happened. Whatever had taken hold of her, it was something far beyond my understanding. A part of her was still in control, but for how long? She shoved me out the door, slamming it behind her as she pressed her face against the glass. "There's no time," she muttered, her voice strained, her face twitching as one eye turned red again. "Go, Thomas, and remember, fear the old blood." Hey guys, that is part 1 of this story. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was plenty scary. Have a happy Halloween. Don't forget to click that like and subscribe button. And don't forget to check out our other videos. Thank you so much for listening this long. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you.